like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm on. I'm based in Western Australia and I work from Curtin University. So we are based on the land of the Whadjuk people, the Noongar Nation. We at Curtin are very proud to accept and respect the advice and knowledge of the elders of the land that we are based on. We respect all the elders, those past, present and emerging, and we work with many groups here in WA to try and encourage better relations and to learn more from them. I've been asked to speak today about basically, I've called it speaking about the unspeakable. And I was asked to speak after one of the ladies here heard a podcast I had done relating to some things in my past and the work that I currently do. I did have this all beautifully worked out and organised, so I'm sorry, it's just not going to be that way anymore. I suppose I should explain who I am and why have been asked to speak. As I said, my name is Robyn. I work at Curtin University. And I'm a domestic violence consultant and a project lead for what we call the Bystander program, or we're literally in the middle of, they've just decided to rebrand it. So we're going to be called the Be There Group project, where we look at creating information and workshops around respect and prevention of gendered violence and respect in the workplace around things like sexual harassment and sexual assault, racism, bullying, and how each individual can play a part in making changes in the smallest way if necessary, or in larger ways when some people, it suits some people, but in a safe way, so how they can all create change and make a difference in their world and people's worlds around them. I am an academic and I also cross into the professional space. Our project, the Bystander project, we work both internally at Curtin University with staff. We have 8,000 staff, and we're just broaching the student space where we have over 60,000 students, some of whom are from other jurisdictions to Western Australia. So we often have to talk about things like sexual harassment and sexual assault in the context of Western Australia and the laws that are relevant to this country. It can be an interesting conversations to have sometimes. We also work commercially. We take the product to particularly resource sector companies to try and help them make better, more respectful and empowering workplaces for all their staff, where it's safe and people can go to work in a happy and safe environment. And if they see things that they're not comfortable and happy with, they can actually do something to make some sort of changes. A large part of the work we do is based in gendered violence, and many people are probably aware of some of the figures that are coming out of Australia at the moment. 62 women have died this year at the hands of violence. Over 50 of those have been by intimate partner violence. 3 were killed in September and 2 in the last week. We're not getting any better. Unfortunately, we talk about this a great deal and many people are appalled by it, but there seems to be very little actually changing. Now, some of you might wonder, well, who is she to actually be the person speaking to us? I am an academic. I'm working on a PhD and my master's at the same time. I tend to do things a lot. I have multiple degrees and qualifications. I'm sorry, my voice is also very croaky because I've been recovering from a bad chest infection that just won't go away. But as well as the academic, what drove me to academia and to start studying and looking at domestic violence and why people tend to treat women this way in our society was because I was in a very bad relationship. I was in a very violent relationship and very abusive relationship for 13 years. I had come from a dysfunctional family at the best of times, and I'm old enough that when I was brought up, being a wife and then a mother was what many women were told to aspire to. when I was young, I was basically told that a really good job, if I was really lucky, would be in a bank or something like that until I got married. I didn't quite take that route. I never quite fit in. I worked around the countryside with horses for a long time because I was a bit crazy like that. And I was a bit of a free spirit, but ultimately, societal pressure and my own pressure to fit and conform, I did marry. And it was a really bad choice. Although I loved my husband and I think I was in love with the idea of romance and relationship, it was not a good marriage. And things changed quite dramatically on our wedding night when I was basically his now. When I wrote that out, it literally had inverted commas around it because that was how it was described to me. And at first, it was only control, things, little things. And early on in a relationship, you're quite happy to give things to your partner to give way on things or to do things that suit them over yourself, because that's what you do for someone you love. You tend to give yourself for them. And like many women, I was always led to believe that my beliefs and my views were less important. And I managed to sort of go along with that for quite some time. It got worse as we went along, and there was more control and more containment of my life. Everything from finance to even though I was earning and working money, back in those days, you actually got paid cash, and I used to bring the cash home and in a sealed envelope, and I was given an allowance of so much per week, and I had very little say in anything that was spent or done. Eventually, it got to a stage where I would be left to do all the running around of paying bills and that, but I was never quite given enough money to do that. It was always a case of robbing people to pay Paul. And that was my failure, not the fact that I wasn't quite given enough money. It was the fact that I wasn't good enough. A lot of these behaviours nowadays are called gaslighting and coercive control. At the time, it was just what I was used to and what I was normal with. I had always believed that if a man hit me, I'd be out of there. But the first time it happened, I think I was so shocked and so scared that I didn't leave. And I began to accept that as the norm. There was sexualised violence too. It was very rare that my needs or my wants were considered. And the idea of rape in marriage was not something that my husband considered anything other than laughable. As his property, I was available any way he wanted, whenever he wanted, or not. Overall, it was pretty bad. Ironically, the thing that woke me up or started building me up again was something that he allowed me to do. The wife of one of his friends started boot scooting or line dancing, and she encouraged me to go along with her, and I did. And he allowed me because, one, I was in company, so, I'd behave. And he could actually spend time with his friend then without the wives in the way. And also, he was pretty confident that I would give it up. I wouldn't last because, frankly, I'd never done much. I'd never actually finished anything. I'd never completed anything. I'd always run away from things. The only problem was that I loved it. And I absolutely fell in love with dance and movement and the music. And I really, really enjoyed being part of a group where I was just me. I wasn't sort of someone's wife or attached to somebody or accompanied by somebody. I was actually offered the opportunity to start teaching, and I started teaching the beginners classes there, and I was allowed to do it because it brought in some money. And then after a while, I involved him in it, in producing some of the music and that was put together for the classes that were being run. But eventually it got to the stage where I started questioning too much, and he blamed the dancing correctly. It had improved my confidence a lot. So I was basically banned from doing it anymore. And in the end, I decided that we needed to work a great deal in our relationship, and he just wasn't open to it. And when I suggested counselling and things like that, there was no way There was nothing wrong with him. He hadn't changed. It was me that was the one who was always fluctuating and wanted more or wanted less or wasn't happy. So I needed to get my act together. I decided that a break might be what we needed. I didn't mean leaving him. I just meant a break for a little while to see if we needed some space to work out what we both really wanted. I ended up lasting a couple of days before giving up, because when he threatened my family and myself, and then ultimately, he would kill himself afterwards, I went back. And that actually became even worse then, because I had given up everything and he had pulled me even closer into control, taken my name off any our joint bank account, so I had no access to money or anything other than without his express handing it to me. The abuse and the sexualised abuse became far, far worse. I had been pregnant multiple times but miscarried, sometimes following beatings, and basically had all but given up when I realised that I was pregnant again. And I was excited and happy and terrified all at once. And I didn't tell him to start off with. I wanted to keep it as to see if I made it through without miscarrying, but also to hang on to it because it was something so joyous. When I did tell him, basically at the end of the first trimester, he was not happy. He decided that we were too old. I was too old. I was too useless to be a mother. I was too fat and disgusting to be a mother. And after a particularly bad beating, and then having to please him and satisfy him because he was then upset at what I had made him do, it was an incredibly horrific night that ended with me killing my husband. I had originally intended to kill myself because I could not bring a child into this and I could no longer continue to exist. And although I did not plan to kill him, it stemmed from an accident and dropping that I'm not going into details, but my husband died and I was responsible. I was arrested and charged with what was then called wilful murder. The charge no longer exists in West Australian law, and I was one of the last women charged in Western Australia with that in relation to killing a spouse. I was actually taken to hospital because I had been very badly beaten, and whilst being interviewed, I had a panic attack that they actually thought was a heart attack because they'd held me in custody for multiple days. And I was taken to Bandyup Women's Prison, which is a maximum security prison in Western Australia. And ironically, I was treated well there, which was really hard, very difficult. I considered myself the most disgusting thing in the world, the worst thing in the world, for having killed somebody that I was supposed to love. And my failure as a mother, my failure as a person in general. But funnily enough, I wasn't treated like that by staff or by the inmates. You see, the funny thing about that was the staff and the inmates knew very well the effects of domestic violence because they'd seen it so often. I was quite appalled to find out that 90% of the women in prison had been victims of either domestic or sexualised violence. And yes, they do other offending and they self-medicate with drugs and they have addictions type of thing. But a lot of it is there's a direct link to the violence and trauma that they have suffered themselves. And no, I am not justifying their criminal behaviour. In prison, I was treated quite well despite it being a very bad and horrid place. Many of the staff there are actually quite good, particularly in places like the education centre. And I was fortunate after a while. It took me probably 3 years to start really feeling like I was me again. During that time, I went to trial, and because I wouldn't say it, I had planned it, and I stressed that it hadn't been my intention to kill my husband, I was not allowed to use the excuse or the defence of domestic violence, because the judge said it could be classified as accidental, so therefore domestic violence was not relevant. I was convicted, and the judge called me a liar and about abuse, and said that women lied about domestic abuse and that I was one of the worst. And he would have sentenced me to longer had he been able to, but he sentenced me to 17 years in prison. I wasn't surprised or anything really. I considered myself the lowest of the low. But there were factual errors in law in the case, and there were grounds for appeal. And my lawyers were very keen to appeal, so I just went along with it, and we did appeal and actually won, and I ended up being retried about another year and a bit later. During that time, I actually found out that I had precancerous cells on an ovary and had to have a hysterectomy the day after I was sentenced. So that was an interesting period of time. In the second trial, the evidence was considered red from the first trial, so it was just basically the same evidence and the same result. The judge was quite different in his attitude, which was pleasing, but the way it works is that the original sentence was said to stand. Whilst we were waiting for the jury to come back, my lawyers were actually very optimistic and spoke about potentially a manslaughter charge or conviction, or even being acquitted. And I was terrified because I did not know how I would survive with my feelings of self-hate, but also how would I survive without the person who had been the structure of my life for so long. We'd been together 13 years, and I had been low in that period for a long time. So I became a full-time prisoner, and all prisoners are assessed for education. And these amazing women there gave me the standard tests, and I just sort of flicked through them because although I left school at 14, I'm well read. And, the standard tests were very simple in my eyes. And the people there, one lady in particular, saw something in me and she encouraged me to start studying more. And she actually tricked me in a funny way into doing a bit of basic study, some writing courses and things that got me interested and engaged. And then one day she told me that I was going to sit the STAT test, which is the special tertiary admissions test for university. And I did. The prison actually paid for the test, and I had to pay them back weekly out of the gratuities you earn. And I passed really well and got into university, and like many people in prison, wanted to study psychology and law because I knew that, something wasn't good in the system and perhaps I could look at it. They don't encourage you to study things like that in prison. It's very difficult to do. And although I ended up changing the direction of my study after a while to sociology and then a double degree in history. Funnily enough, a lot of the sociology I studied was about governance and rule and law, criminality, and the way women were treated, particularly in law, over history. And a lot of the history units were also based on the same thing. When I graduated with a double degree, I sat there looking at the results, not even the fancy sheet, but just the actual results, feeling so stunned that I had actually done this. But I was also addicted to it. I loved study. I loved using my mind. I loved being able to learn and opening my mind up to things. And it allowed me to actually start thinking about a lot of things about my own story. So I started being open to the idea of having counselling. And it takes a lot to get counselling in prison, particularly if you're a long-termer, because they don't want to sort of spend money on someone who's going to be there a long time until the very end, and they'll throw things at you. But again, I was lucky, and we had a very proactive senior officer, a female, who got me in to see a young counsellor. And I spent a lot of time talking to him and opening up about myself. When I started the therapy, I was actually very determined to find out if I had a right to be alive, and that was the main reason I started the therapy. And I had been very intent on killing myself for quite a while because I decided I had no right to be alive. But the thinking part of my brain started addressing what might be the case. So I started therapy. I started studying, amongst other things, criminology and then teaching. And I started teaching in the prison. And we started looking at courses that I developed for women in prison. And I realized that I loved this sort of work and I became really engaged in it. And because I wasn't paid, because I was a prisoner, we were able to use me a lot to put a lot of courses in place. I was released from prison in November of 2016, and it was a huge shock. Although there are pre-release systems in place, and I had actually gone to a pre-release centre and I did have a part-time job, it was still a really big shock. And there I was, 58 years old, nearly 59, with nothing but the money that I had saved up in prison that my very caring and supportive sister had matched. So I had enough to set myself up in an apartment. I had a part-time job that did not earn a great deal. And my brother had bought me a little runaround for $1,000 odd, so I had transport. And I was out in the big bad world again, and it was very, very hard. I became more involved and engaged in talking about domestic violence and quietly worked with some women who needed a bit of support or to talk to people who had been in a bit of situation. And a bit of time progressed, and then I was retrenched with many other people because the company I was working for lost a massive contract. And there were times when I found myself wondering if my cats and I, because yes, I have cats, I am a childless cat lady, and I embrace the term of a crazy cat lady quite happily. It was something I was very determined to have, was animals, when I was released from prison. So I was left wondering if my cats and I would be able to live in my car. That is how hard and that is how bad it got. I was given things like furniture and things for the kitchen, so I wasn't that bad off. But having a roof over my head, having security, became exceptionally important to me. And even today, I am exceptionally concerned about it. And in this rental market, it is very, very hard. In Western Australia, the rental market is very tight. I'm lucky that I'm currently working in a well-paid position, so I can afford when they put the rents up, touch wood. But there are many women in my age group and that who are now facing very tough situations about being able to afford a home because domestic violence affects many old women nowadays in ways that leave them without a lot of financial support. Now, my retirement plans include winning a lotto, so I've sort of got to basically to retire, I'm going to need to do something where I can bring money in, and lotto is probably the best way of doing it, and that tells you something. But one thing I've discovered is that as you get older, I've become quite invisible. And I've noticed it in both good and bad ways. So I can be at a counter. Now, I'm not small, I'm tall and I'm large. So how people can not see me, I really do find it quite amusing. I tend to find it difficult to understand how people can not see somebody. But it happens a lot because older women are considered other than or next to or not that relevant to anything. I was going to talk about domestic violence and sex and how women of our sort of age bracket aren't considered to be sexual. And, you know, when you mention sex and old people, people tend to run away screaming. But the truth is we are still loving, sensual beings. Now, my personal circumstances might not mean that I actually want an intimate relationship again, but it doesn't mean that I don't want the choice. In many ways, I do a lot now that is really good and I'm very proud of. And although there are many insecurities in my life, I'm actually having a really good life. I have a lot of joy and I quite like my life. I mentioned my cats. I was very determined to have something to love in my life. I've put an extension, completely removable, enclosure on the back of my house so I can watch my animals in the sun, and I sit and look at them and have so much joy. And my life with good friends and so many supportive people. And my main colleague that I work with is a gay gentleman, and he and his husband are so good to me. I have family and friends that I've met, yet I consider myself quite a hermit because I choose to be at times. I have made a lot of choices, particularly post-COVID, about the fact that I can't be bothered anymore with some people. So I've drawn boundaries and lines where I go, "Nah, not today." And I'm proud of myself, and I'm allowed to do that. And that's one of the joys, I think, of being older and becoming more comfortable in yourself, is that you can go, something that actually doesn't really work for me. And it's really hard to do. So don't think I'm glossing over it or anything like that. It's very difficult to do. But equally, it's easier now that I'm older and much more aware of my own value and power. I forget sometimes the power of my own story, and occasionally I'll talk about it, and people get quite stunned, and I sort of think, "Oh, but that's my normal." And like many women in domestic violence situations, we accept it as our normal. But I'm here to say there is joy, and there is hope, and there is love, and we are here, and we are not invisible. And if we want relationships, and if we want intimacy, then go the hell for it and enjoy. Because I've been in situations where there was no joy. I've been in situations where there was no care, where there was no hope, where death seemed quite a good option. Now, no. My health isn't perfect. It's a long way from good, but it's better than a lot of other options. I really consider myself quite lucky, and I consider myself at times quite strong, and I consider myself part of an amazing sisterhood of women. And we all need to stand up and say, "We're here. Don't you dare ignore us." Thank you.